The sun crept gently over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gold, and the first light filtered through the tall pines surrounding my cabin. It was one of those mornings where the world felt untouched, pure, and still. The kind of morning that reminded me why I kept coming back here, year after year, to this quiet retreat away from the chaos of the city. I stepped out onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking familiarly under my boots, and set down my steaming cup of coffee on the railing. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and for a moment it felt like time had slowed down. Out here, no one bothered me. No traffic, no buzzing phones, no endless HOA letters about what shade of beige a house had to be painted. Just me, my cabin, and the land that stretched farther than most people could imagine. I leaned back in the old rocking chair that had been here since my grandfather built this cabin. It was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a reminder of him, of the roots my family had planted in this land long before the subdivisions and gated communities crept closer. Every time I sat there, I felt grounded, reminded that this wasn't just some random vacation home. This land had history, my history. I'd grown up hearing stories about how my grandfather had worked this very soil, how he'd secured rights to the land when no one else cared about it. People saw just a cabin in the woods, but I saw a legacy stretching across hills, creeks, and valleys. What most didn't know, what very few could even imagine, was the sheer scale of it all, the boundaries that didn't stop at the cabin fence but continued outward, covering more than anyone suspected. Taking a slow sip of coffee, I closed my eyes and let the quietness wrap around me. The only sounds were the distant call of a hawk circling above and the occasional rustle of squirrels darting across fallen leaves. My truck sat parked beside the cabin, its bed still carrying supplies I had brought in the night before, extra firewood, tools, and enough food to last a week. My plan was simple: disconnect from everything, recharge, and remind myself of why I worked so hard in the first place. Out here, surrounded by untouched wilderness, I wasn't just another name on an HOA roster or another face behind a mailbox. I was free. And that freedom, that connection to the land, was worth more than anything money could buy. But even as I sat there in my calm, soaking in the morning peace, a thought tugged at the back of my mind, an awareness that peace never lasts forever. Not out here. Over the years, as development crept closer and cookie-cutter houses began sprouting like weeds, I'd noticed something else creeping in too: people. The type who thought rules were more important than respect, the type who measured their worth by how much control they could exert over others. People who didn't understand the wild, didn't appreciate the history, and certainly didn't respect the fact that not every square inch of land was theirs to manage. Out here, they saw a cabin and assumed it belonged to someone they could boss around, someone they could intimidate. And though I hadn't yet seen trouble that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that the calm was only the opening act. Still, I wasn't about to let that feeling ruin my morning. I stood, stretched my arms wide, and breathed in deeply, the mountain air filling my lungs. This was my land, my retreat, my family's legacy. Whatever storm might be waiting down the road, whatever arguments, confrontations, or conflicts might come, I felt ready. Because one thing I knew for certain, one truth no one could argue with, was this: I wasn't just a visitor here. I wasn't trespassing, squatting, or borrowing time. I was home. And anyone who thought otherwise was in for a surprise they'd never forget. The quiet rhythm of the morning was broken by the low growl of an approaching engine. At first, I thought it might be one of the locals, a neighbor passing through on their way to town, maybe an old rancher checking fences. But as the sound grew louder, crunching gravel under heavy tires, my instincts told me otherwise. This wasn't the kind of vehicle you usually saw out here. I set my coffee cup down, squinting through the trees, and sure enough, a shiny white SUV emerged from the bend in the dirt road, its polished chrome grille flashing in the sunlight like it didn't belong in the wilderness. Dust swirled in its wake, choking the air as it pulled right up to the edge of my clearing. I frowned. Folks who came up here usually had a reason, and judging by the way this one came barreling in, I had a strong suspicion that whatever was about to unfold wasn't going to be pleasant. The SUV rolled to a halt like it owned the place, tires spitting gravel onto my driveway. The engine cut off, and before the dust even settled, the driver's door flew open. Out stepped a woman dressed far too neatly for the woods, pressed slacks, a starched blouse, and oversized sunglasses perched on her face. She clutched a leather binder in one hand and a phone in the other, her every movement sharp, impatient, as though she was stepping onto a stage she'd rehearsed for all her life. Even from the porch, I could tell what kind of person she was. The haircut alone screamed entitlement, every strand locked into a perfect bob that framed her scowl like armor. I didn't need to guess who she was. I already knew. Every neighborhood had one. The self-appointed enforcer of rules. The self-declared guardian of property values. The one who lived not to enjoy life, but to make sure everyone else lived by her standards. Out here, she had another name, Karen. She slammed her door shut and marched forward with a gait that could only be described as aggressive, her heels clicking against the dirt as though even nature itself should adjust to her presence. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. Instead, she stopped dead center in the clearing, lifted her sunglasses with one hand, and looked me up and down like I was an intruder on my own porch. "Excuse me," she barked, her tone laced with authority that she hadn't earned. "What exactly are you doing here?" For a moment, I just stared at her, half expecting it to be some sort of joke. Who barges onto private land and demands answers like that? But her face, tight and severe, told me she wasn't here for small talk. She was here to make a point, and that point was aimed squarely at me. I leaned forward in my rocking chair, steady and calm, trying to gauge how much patience this woman was going to require. "What I'm doing," I said evenly, "is enjoying my morning coffee on my property." I gestured toward the cabin, the stack of firewood, the parked truck, every piece of evidence that this was no temporary setup, no weekend squatter's camp. But she didn't even glance at it. Instead, she snorted, flipping open her leather binder and shuffling through papers like she had a warrant to deliver. "This land," she snapped, "is under HOA jurisdiction. You can't just set up camp wherever you feel like it. Cabins like this aren't allowed. You're trespassing." Her words hit the air with the weight of final judgment, as if by declaring it, she'd made it true. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a mocking laugh, not yet, but a slow, disbelieving chuckle that slipped out before I could stop it. This woman had no idea where she was standing. No idea who she was talking to. And no idea how deep she was about to dig her own hole. She mistook my calm for weakness, my silence for guilt. But the truth was, in that moment, I was already miles ahead of her. Because while she stood there clutching her binder of half-baked HOA rules, convinced she was policing her tidy little neighborhood, she didn't realize she'd just wandered onto something much, much bigger. Karen stood there like a judge about to deliver a sentence, her binder clutched to her chest as if it were some holy book of HOA law. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the cabin behind me as though the sight of weathered wood and stone offended her very soul. "You need to leave," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "This structure is not approved by the HOA, and you don't have authorization to be here. I'm giving you 5 minutes to pack up your things and go before I call the authorities." She folded her arms, smug and certain, like she'd just won the argument by declaring herself victorious. I didn't move. Instead, I rose slowly from the rocking chair, my boots landing solidly on the porch with a thud that echoed louder than her threats. I walked down the steps, each one deliberate, until I was standing eye to eye with her in the clearing. I wasn't trying to intimidate her, but I wanted her to see something in me that her binder didn't account for. I wasn't afraid. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "this is my land. This cabin has stood here for decades, long before any HOA lines were drawn on a map. You're mistaken if you think you have any authority here." My voice wasn't raised, but it carried enough weight that for the first time, a flicker of doubt flashed across her face. Of course, it didn't last. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and sneered. "Do you think I don't know what's going on here? I've dealt with squatters before. People like you try to sneak onto community property, build little shacks, and then act like you belong here. Well, not on my watch. I'll have this reported, and you'll be gone by sundown." She jabbed a finger toward the cabin like it was some kind of crime scene, her voice trembling with righteous fury. I could see the cracks now. This wasn't about community property. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. Karen didn't come here to enforce the HOA's authority. She came here because she couldn't stand the idea of someone being free where she wasn't in charge. I let her words hang in the air for a moment, then took a step closer, lowering my voice so it carried a calm steadiness she couldn't ignore. "Let me explain something to you. You don't get to tell me to leave. You don't get to decide what happens here. You see this cabin? It was built by my grandfather, on land he purchased outright. This property doesn't fall under your HOA's reach, and it never will. So if you think you can threaten me with paperwork and phone calls, you're in for a very rude awakening. Her eyes widened slightly, but pride kept her mouth tight, locked into that familiar Karen scowl. For a moment, the clearing went silent. Just the two of us, locked in a standoff of wills. A hawk screeched overhead, circling lazily as though it was watching the drama unfold. Karen shifted on her feet, gripping her binder tighter, but she didn't back down. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her lips curling into a smirk. "We'll see about that," she hissed. "You can spin whatever little story you want, but once the police get here, you'll have no choice but to leave. And when they do, I'll make sure the HOA fines you for every single day you've been squatting here." She tapped her screen with exaggerated confidence, as though the act itself had already sealed my fate. I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. I just smiled, slow and steady, the kind of smile that told her she was playing a game she didn't understand. Because what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly wrap her head around, was that I wasn't bluffing. She thought I was some stubborn squatter clinging to a rundown shack, when in reality, I was the one holding all the cards. And soon enough, when the truth came crashing down, Karen would find out exactly who she was messing with. Karen's fingers danced over her phone like she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She held it high, deliberately, like a badge of authority, as if the act of dialing 3 little numbers made her judge, jury, and executioner all in one. I watched as she pressed 911, her voice already sharp before the call even connected. "Yes, hello," she barked, her tone shrill with a mix of panic and superiority. "This is an emergency. There's a dangerous man trespassing on HOA property. He's refusing to leave and is becoming hostile." Her words spilled out like poison, carefully crafted to paint me as the villain in her story. She clutched her leather binder to her chest like evidence, glancing at me with smug triumph, as though the police were about to descend from the sky at her command. I leaned against the porch railing, arms folded, listening with quiet disbelief as she spun her tale. Hostile. Dangerous. I hadn't raised my voice once. The only thing dangerous here was her ego. But Karen's voice grew louder, more dramatic, every syllable dripping with theatrical exaggeration. "Yes, officer," she continued. "He's squatting in some run-down cabin, and I fear for my safety. Please send someone immediately. I don't feel safe with this man here." Her hand trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear, it was excitement. Karen wasn't scared of me. She was thrilled by the performance. She was addicted to the power of making that call, of summoning the law like a weapon to enforce her will. The operator must have asked for details, because Karen launched into a full-blown description, waving her free hand around as if the dispatcher could see her gestures through the phone. "Yes, it's on Oak Ridge Road, past the development," she said breathlessly. "Big, ugly wooden cabin. Probably doesn't even meet code. And this man, he's standing right in front of me, glaring at me. I think he might attack me at any moment." She shot me a quick glance, eyes narrowing into a glare, trying to provoke me into reacting, into giving her some real ammunition to justify her lies. But I stayed perfectly calm, leaning back against the post, sipping what was left of my coffee. My composure seemed to frustrate her even more. She wanted me to snap, to yell, to storm toward her so she could shriek into the phone that she was under attack. But all she got was silence. Her voice grew higher, shriller, as the call dragged on. "Yes, send multiple officers," she insisted. "This man is refusing to comply, and he looks very unstable. I think he might be armed." That last accusation hung in the air like a gunshot. Armed. She had just crossed a line. I straightened, the weight of her words settling heavy in my chest. It wasn't just a lie anymore, it was a dangerous fabrication, one that could change the entire nature of the police response. Karen wasn't just crying wolf, she was painting a target on my back. And she didn't care. In her mind, I was just some trespasser, some nobody standing in the way of her authority. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. When she finally hung up, she slipped her phone into her pocket with the air of someone who believed they had already won. Her smirk returned, smug and unshakable, as she crossed her arms and stared at me like she was savoring her victory. "They'll be here soon," she said coldly. "And when they arrive, you'll regret ever setting foot on this property. The HOA doesn't tolerate people like you." Her tone dripped with satisfaction, like a queen declaring her enemy's fate. She thought she had orchestrated the perfect trap, that the flashing lights of squad cars would soon flood the clearing, that the police would drag me away in handcuffs, and that she'd stand tall as the hero of the community. But as I stood there in the calm after her storm of lies, I couldn't help but smile. Because while Karen thought she had all the power, she didn't know the truth. She didn't know about the deeds in my safe. She didn't know about the county records with my family's name printed clear as day. She didn't know that the very officers she had summoned would soon discover she hadn't just called them to enforce rules. She had dragged them onto land that legally, undeniably, belonged to me. And when that truth came out, Karen's smug little performance would collapse like the fragile facade it was. She had no idea she had just set herself up for the most humiliating downfall of her life. The call ended, but the air in the clearing felt heavier than before. Karen tucked her phone away like a weapon she had just fired, standing tall with that smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across her face. She didn't say much at first. She didn't have to. The silence was her victory parade, her chance to savor what she believed was the inevitable outcome. Every now and then she'd glance at me, raising an eyebrow as if to remind me that the cavalry was on its way, and in her mind, that meant my time was running out. I leaned back against the porch post, arms folded across my chest, and met her gaze with calm indifference. If she thought her smug little stares were going to rattle me, she was sorely mistaken. I dealt with storms bigger than her. And unlike Karen, I knew the truth was on my side. Minutes ticked by, the forest wrapping us in its natural stillness. A breeze stirred the treetops, sending pine needles whispering down onto the cabin roof. Somewhere off in the distance, a woodpecker tapped at a trunk, a rhythm so steady it almost mocked the tension between us. Karen shifted on her heels, clearly impatient, but unwilling to break the silence. Finally, she huffed, pulling out her binder again and rifling through the papers like they were ammunition she was preparing to fire the moment the police arrived. "You know," she said with a sly smile, "the HOA doesn't go easy on people like you. Trespassing fines are one thing, but when you add in unapproved structures, code violations, and potential safety hazards..." She let her voice trail off, tilting her head as if she was already calculating the astronomical total. "You might as well hand over the keys to that shack right now." I almost laughed. The way she spoke, you'd think she was a federal prosecutor building a case against me instead of a nosy busybody waving a binder full of meaningless HOA newsletters. I stepped forward, not aggressively, but close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet my eyes. "You keep talking about rules and fines and violations," I said evenly, "but here's the thing, you're playing a game that doesn't even apply here. This land isn't under your HOA. It never has been. You're standing on private property that's been in my family for generations, and you don't have a shred of authority here. All that paperwork you're clutching? It's as worthless as the ink it's printed with." My words landed with a steady force of truth, but Karen just scoffed, shaking her head as if I were a child telling tall tales. Her impatience was starting to bleed through the cracks in her confidence. She checked her watch, shifted her weight, and began pacing the edge of the clearing like a restless animal. Every sound in the distance, a car backfiring on the highway, a branch snapping under the weight of some animal, made her stiffen and glance toward the road. She was waiting for the sirens, the flashing lights, the moment she could step aside and let the officers do her bidding. And yet, beneath her smug surface, I could see it, doubt creeping in, a small but growing fear that maybe, just maybe, the story she'd spun on that 911 call wouldn't play out the way she imagined. Meanwhile, the neighbors had started to notice. A couple of them had wandered out of their houses on the far edge of the road, drawn by the sound of Karen's raised voice and the sight of her SUV parked like a barricade in front of my cabin. They lingered at a distance, whispering to each other, curious but cautious. They knew Karen's reputation. They'd seen her crusades before, how she loved to swoop in with her clipboard and accusations, declaring herself the guardian of order. But this was different. This wasn't a misparked car or a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige. This was a full-blown confrontation, and the stakes were higher. I could see it in their faces. They were waiting to see who would blink first. And still, I didn't move. I leaned against the porch, calm and unshaken, letting Karen stew in the mess she'd created. I knew what was coming, even if she didn't. The longer we waited, the more certain I became. When those police cars rolled up, the truth would start unraveling her story piece by piece. Karen thought she was writing the script, but in reality, she was just setting the stage for her own downfall. And when the curtain finally rose, she would learn the one thing she couldn't stand to accept, that no matter how loudly she shouted, no matter how many binders she waved or calls she made, this was my land. And nothing she did could ever change that. The low rumble of engines cut through the forest silence long before the flashing lights appeared. Karen's head snapped up, her smug grin widening as if Christmas had come early. She straightened her blouse, tucked her binder under her arm like a badge of honor, and marched toward the edge of the driveway as though she were the one who had summoned soldiers to battle. Gravel crunched beneath tires as 2 squad cars rolled into the clearing, their red and blue lights painting streaks across the trees. The neighbors perked up instantly, some stepping closer to get a better look, others whispering excitedly about what was happening. Karen held her ground like she was about to receive an award, raising one manicured hand in the air to wave them down, eager to take center stage in her self-made drama. The officers stepped out with practiced calm, 2 men in uniform whose expressions gave nothing away. They scanned the scene with professional precision, first at the cabin, then at me leaning against the porch railing, and finally at Karen, who practically ran to intercept them. "Officers! Thank God you're here!" she exclaimed, her voice pitched high with false relief. She pointed a dramatic finger in my direction as though she had just caught a fugitive. "That man is trespassing on HOA property. He's been aggressive, he refuses to leave, and I believe he may even be armed." Her voice trembled just enough to sell the performance, though I noticed how quickly she recovered her composure once she was sure they were listening. The taller of the 2 officers held up a hand, steady and measured. "Ma'am, slow down," he said. "We'll handle this. Just take a step back for now." But Karen didn't move. She hovered, practically buzzing with excitement, her eyes darting between them and me as if she couldn't wait for the moment they slapped cuffs on my wrists. The shorter officer glanced my way, his expression cautious but not hostile. "Sir," he called out, "mind if we have a word?" I stepped off the porch slowly, hands visible, calm and deliberate. I dealt with law enforcement enough to know the importance of composure, especially with a lie like Karen's hanging in the air. "Of course, officers," I said evenly. "Happy to clear this up." Before they could even ask a question, Karen bulldozed back into the conversation. "Clear this up!" she shrieked, nearly shoving her binder into the officer's chest. "This man is squatting. He's violating community rules. He's a danger to all of us. Look at that shack. It's not up to code. It's a fire hazard. And he threatened me when I told him to leave." Her words tumbled over each other, frantic and breathless, the kind of performance designed to overwhelm rather than inform. She wanted to drown the officers in her version of the truth before I had the chance to speak. But the officers weren't rushing to judgment. They were trained to spot hysteria, to sift through noise. And right now, Karen was making a lot of noise. Finally, one of them turned back to me. "Sir, can you tell us your side of the story?" His tone was calm, professional, but I could see the weight in his eyes. He knew Karen's accusations were serious, especially the claim about me being armed. I met his gaze steadily. "Officers," I began, "I'm standing on my own property. This cabin was built by my grandfather decades ago, and this land has been in my family since before any HOA even existed in this area. I'm not squatting. I'm not trespassing. And I certainly haven't threatened anyone." I paused, letting my words sink in, then added, "As for being armed, I'm not carrying any weapon." She made that up. The officers exchanged a glance, their professional masks never slipping, but I caught the subtle shift in their posture, a recognition that the situation wasn't as simple as Karen had made it out to be. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up her stage. "He's lying!" she screamed, jabbing a finger at me again. "Check the records. The HOA governs all of this land, and I'm on the board. I know the rules. He doesn't belong here." Her voice had lost its polished veneer now. Desperation cracked through her words. She needed them to believe her. She needed this moment to validate her control. But the taller officer turned to her, his expression firm. "Ma'am, we'll check the records. Right now, We need you to calm down and step aside while we sort this out." The words hit her like a slap. For the first time since she'd arrived, Karen faltered. She opened her mouth to protest, but the officer's steady gaze left no room for argument. She stepped back reluctantly, clutching her binder tighter, her eyes burning with rage as she glared at me. In her mind, this wasn't over. But in that moment, with the flashing lights reflecting off the cabin walls and the officers standing between us, the balance of power had shifted. The stage was no longer hers, it was mine. The taller officer pulled a small notepad from his vest pocket, his pen poised as he turned back to me. "Sir, do you have any proof of ownership? Documents, ID, anything that can confirm what you're telling us?" His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for exaggeration or bluffing. I nodded slowly, keeping my movement steady, and walked back toward the cabin. Karen scoffed loudly from the side, muttering under her breath about how I was stalling and making things up, but I ignored her. I reached inside the door, opened the lockbox bolted to the wall, and pulled out a thick manila folder. When I turned back, I held it high so everyone could see, the officers, the neighbors who had crept closer, and most importantly, Karen. I handed the folder over to the nearest officer. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first few pages, notarized deeds, county records, tax receipts, all with my name stamped clearly across them. He turned another page, then another, his brow furrowing deeper with every document he read. His partner leaned over to take a look, and the two exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. Karen, growing restless, stepped forward and tried to peek over their shoulders, but the taller officer raised a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, please stay back," he said sternly. That single command, spoken without hesitation, wiped the smugness off her face for the first time that morning. I cleared my throat and addressed them directly. "This cabin, and the land it sits on, has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather secured the deed back when this county barely had a courthouse. That's not just this clearing, gentlemen, that's thousands of acres. My family name is on every single record in the county office. The HOA doesn't own this land. They never have. And the woman standing there accusing me—" I gestured toward Karen, whose face was now flushed with a cocktail of rage and embarrassment. "She's trespassing on my property right now." The words hung in the clearing like thunder after lightning. Neighbors murmured in shock, their whispers turning into gasps as the truth sank in. Karen's composure cracked like glass under pressure. That's impossible," she stammered, her voice climbing an octave. She snatched her binder open, frantically flipping through papers as if she could conjure legitimacy out of thin air. "The HOA governs this entire community. We set the rules, we enforce them. He's lying. He has to be." But her binder was filled with nothing but bylaws and newsletters, the kind of paperwork that only mattered within the narrow borders of their subdivision. Out here, beyond those lines, her authority meant absolutely nothing. The officers, still examining my documents, finally closed the folder and handed it back with a nod of quiet respect. "Everything checks out," the shorter one said. "You're the legal owner of this property. There's no violation here." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her face frozen in disbelief. For years, she had thrived on control, built her identity on enforcing rules and bending others to her will. But in this moment, all of that collapsed. She had called the police on the very person who not only owned the cabin, but the land surrounding it, land that extended farther than her HO could even dream of touching. The neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances, some of them even chuckling under their breath as the reality set in. Karen hadn't exposed a squatter. She had exposed herself. I slipped the folder back under my arm and turned to her, my voice calm but edged with steel. "You came onto my property, accused me of crimes I didn't commit, and lied to the police. You wanted to humiliate me, but all you did was humiliate yourself. The next time you think about calling 911, maybe you should ask yourself whether you're the one trespassing." Karen's face went red, then pale, then red again, her emotions spinning in a storm she couldn't control. She wanted to shout back, to reclaim the upper hand, but the officer's steady presence and the weight of undeniable truth pinned her down like chains. For the first time since she had arrived, Karen was speechless. The binder that once gave her power now looked like a child's notebook compared to the legal weight of the deeds I had shown. The neighbors, once hesitant and curious, now stared at her with thinly veiled amusement, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. Karen had written her script expecting a grand victory, but instead, she had set the stage for her most humiliating defeat. And deep down, I could see it in her eyes. She knew there was no way out. Karen's silence didn't last long. Humiliation has a way of forcing pride to lash out, and hers was no exception. She snapped her binder shut with a loud clap, the sound echoing through the clearing like a gunshot, and glared at me with wild, desperate eyes. "This isn't over," she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. "You can't just hide behind some dusty old paperwork. The HOA has power, you'll see. We'll take this higher, and when we do, you'll regret ever defying me." Her words spilled out in a frenzy, no longer controlled or polished, but sharp and frantic, like a cornered animal fighting against the inevitable. The officers didn't flinch. The taller one stepped forward, his expression firm but professional. "Ma'am, that's enough," he said, his voice cutting through her tirade. "You made a false report, you wasted emergency resources, and you trespassed on private property. If you don't calm yourself right now, you'll leave us with no choice but to take action against you." The threat was measured, but the meaning was clear. Karen's eyes widened, her face paling at the realization that her little power play might end with her in handcuffs. For someone so obsessed with control, the thought of being dragged away in front of her neighbors was the ultimate humiliation. And the neighbors were watching, every second of it. By now, a small crowd had gathered along the road, some leaning on fences, others holding their phones up to record. They whispered to each other, trading knowing looks and stifled laughter. For years, Karen had tormented them with citations, fines, and endless complaints. She'd written letters about unmowed lawns, about kids playing too loudly, even about Christmas decorations that didn't fit the aesthetic. And now, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was being publicly dismantled, her authority shredded piece by piece. You could almost feel the relief ripple through the crowd, the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice served without them having to lift a finger. Karen's desperation boiled over. She jabbed a trembling finger at me, her voice breaking into a screech. "You don't understand. People like him ruin communities. He's dangerous. But her rant was cut off as the shorter officer raised a hand sharply. "Ma'am," he said sternly, "that's enough. One more word, and we'll escort you off this property ourselves." The finality in his tone slammed into her like a brick wall. For the first time in her life, Karen had run out of words. She stood frozen, breathing heavily, her face a blotchy mix of red and white. Her binder, once her weapon, now dangled uselessly at her side. I took a step forward, not to gloat but to finish what she had started. My voice was calm, measured, and loud enough for every neighbor to hear. "Karen, you called 911 because you thought I was trespassing on land I own. You lied to the police, you tried to humiliate me, and you dragged half the neighborhood into your drama. And now everyone sees you for what you are, a bully with no power outside of the little box you live in." The crowd murmured, a mix of agreement and stifled laughter. Karen's lips trembled as though she wanted to retort, but no sound came. She had nothing left. The officers turned to her one last time. "It's time for you to leave," the taller one said firmly. "No." Karen hesitated, looking around desperately for some shred of support, but all she saw were smirks, raised eyebrows, and phones recording her every twitch. No allies. No backup. Just a community that had grown tired of her reign and was savoring every second of her downfall. Finally, with a defeated huff, she spun on her heel and stomped back to her SUV. She fumbled with her keys, her movements jerky and clumsy, before yanking the door open and slamming it shut so hard the sound rattled through the clearing. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying in all directions as her pristine white vehicle disappeared in a cloud of dust. As the silence settled back over the clearing, the tension lifted with it. The officers turned back to me, their faces calm but carrying the faintest hints of approval. "Sorry for the trouble, sir," the shorter one said. "We'll make sure this is noted in the report. If she gives you any more problems, don't hesitate to call us." I nodded, thanking them sincerely, then glanced toward the neighbors still clustered at the roadside. Some of them smiled and waved, others whispered excitedly, but all of them knew they had just witnessed something monumental. Karen, the untouchable enforcer of the HOA, had been humbled on the very ground she thought she controlled. And as I walked back toward the porch, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Karen had tried to strip me of my dignity, to paint me as an intruder on my own land, but in the end, she had only exposed herself. Her downfall wasn't just about me, it was about everyone she had ever pushed around, every neighbor she had ever silenced. For the first time, they had seen her lose. And they would never look at her the same way again. The dust from Karen's SUV still hung in the air like a lingering shadow when the silence finally broke. A chuckle from somewhere in the crowd rippled outward until it became a wave of quiet laughter. The neighbors, who had all kept their distance when the police arrived, now stepped forward cautiously, their faces lit with relief and something else, vindication. It was as though a dam had burst, years of pent-up frustration finally spilling free. People exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering in tones that dripped with satisfaction. For the first time in a long while, the weight of Karen's presence had lifted, and you could feel it in the air. A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt was the first to speak. He stepped closer, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Well," he said with a chuckle, "I guess the Queen just lost her crown." His words drew a round of muffled laughter from the others. A woman holding her toddler on her hip chimed in next, her voice tinged with relief. "She's been terrorizing us for years. Letters in the mailbox, fines for nonsense, threats of lawsuits. I can't tell you how many nights I stayed awake worrying about what she'd pull next." She looked at me then, her eyes warm. "And you, standing up to her like that, it was something we all wished we could do." Her words carried a quiet weight, and others nodded in agreement, their expressions softening toward me. More neighbors joined in, their stories spilling out like water from a cracked jar. A young man spoke about how Karen fined him for leaving his trash can out for 2 extra hours. An elderly couple recalled the time she berated them over their holiday lights, insisting their decorations were unapproved. Someone else mentioned how she threatened to tow cars during a neighborhood gathering, claiming the street wasn't wide enough for safety standards. Each story painted the same picture, a woman who had thrived on control, feeding on fear and compliance. And now, for the first time, they weren't whispering behind closed doors, they were speaking freely, right in the open. The officers listened quietly at first, standing a respectful distance away, but even they couldn't hide the faint smirks tugging at their mouths as the stories piled up. One of them finally said, "Seems like she's been keeping you all on edge." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices overlapping with complaints and grievances, some frustrated, others laced with humor. It was almost cathartic, a group therapy session happening right there in my driveway. I leaned against the porch railing, listening, absorbing it all, realizing that Karen's downfall wasn't just a personal victory, it was a collective one. She hadn't just tried to strip me of my dignity, she had been stripping pieces away from everyone here, little by little, year after year. And now they finally had the chance to breathe. One neighbor, a man with sharp eyes and a weary expression, summed it up best. "You know," he said slowly, "it took the police, a stack of deeds, and Karen practically screaming herself hoarse for us to see what we should have realized all along. She only had power because we gave it to her. We let her bully us into thinking she was untouchable. But tonight," he glanced around, gesturing at the group, "we all saw she's not." His words struck deep, silencing the murmurs for a moment as the truth settled in. The HOA queen had been dethroned, not by force, but by the truth and the courage to stand firm against her lies. As the evening light faded and the last of the neighbors began to drift back to their homes, the mood was lighter than it had been in years. People lingered longer than usual, chatting, laughing, and even making tentative plans for a neighborhood cookout, something Karen would never have allowed. The officers gave me a final nod before heading back to their cruisers, their flashing lights fading into the distance. I stood on the porch, watching the crowd disperse, feeling the shift in the air. For the first time in a long while, the community felt like a community again. Karen's shadow had been lifted, and in its place was something brighter, solidarity, relief, and the promise of change. The next morning, the forest felt different. The same sunlight filtered through the trees, the same breeze rustled the leaves, but there was a freshness in the air, as though the land itself had shaken off a heavy weight. I stood on the porch of the cabin, coffee mug in hand, and listened to the quiet hum of life returning to normal. For the first time since Karen had burst onto my driveway with her binder of rules and her false authority, there was peace. Real peace. And with it came a sense of possibility, a clean slate for the community that had been living under her thumb for far too long. Word of the incident had spread quickly. By the afternoon, neighbors began trickling back, some out of curiosity, others simply to talk. But this time, the conversations were different. They weren't whispered complaints about Karen or grumbles about fines. They were filled with laughter, shared stories, and plans for the future. A few people approached me directly, thanking me for standing firm when Karen had tried to twist the truth. Others simply smiled, their relief written clearly across their faces. For years, fear of retaliation had kept them quiet. Now, the silence was broken, and in its place grew something new: solidarity. The following weekend, something happened that would have been unthinkable just days before. Without Karen's looming presence dictating every detail, the neighbors organized a gathering. Folding tables appeared along the roadside, covered in dishes from kitchens up and down the block: casseroles, pies, barbecued meats, bowls of fruit. Children who had once been scolded for riding bikes too loudly now zipped back and forth freely, their laughter echoing through the air. Music played from a speaker, simple and joyful, and for the first time in years, no one worried about whether it was approved. The weight of Karen's constant watch had lifted, and the community blossomed in its absence. I walked among them, listening to their chatter, shaking hands, sharing in the food. Many of them admitted they had felt powerless under Karen's rule, trapped by the belief that the HOA's authority was absolute. But seeing the truth, seeing her lies exposed and her power crumble, had changed everything. They realized that they didn't need her to dictate their lives. They could build their own sense of order, their own sense of pride in their neighborhood, without her iron grip. It wasn't about rejecting rules altogether. It was about reclaiming their freedom from fear. And in that moment, the neighborhood felt more alive than it ever had under her control. As the sun dipped low and the first stars appeared, I found myself back on my porch, watching the glow of the gathering from a distance. My cabin, once at the center of conflict, had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that standing firm in the face of lies and intimidation could change more than just one life. It had shifted the entire community. Karen had tried to strip me of my place, but instead, she had lost hers. The people she once controlled had seen her for what she truly was, and in doing so, they had found their own strength. A new beginning had taken root, not just for me, but for everyone she had once overshadowed. And as I took a final sip of coffee, the night air cool and calm, I knew this was only the start of something greater.